right, kind of an extra video because we will be making a point to do this in class following, like immediately following section 3.2. We're going to kind of run through kind of a summary review. So you should have this paper, and so again, this is getting done with like 3.1, which was the law of sines, and section 3.2, which was the law of cosines. So this should sort of summarize both of them, because together they kind of paint, you know, the whole picture of solving these triangles. So here we go. If what you are given is two angles right away, you know, and a side, so you're given like two angles and a side, and you focus on the fact that you were given two angles. None of the following handout comes into play, okay? Because if you're given two angles right away, you just find the third angle really quick with like middle school geometry knowledge, and then you use the law of sines to get the missing sides, and there's no concern or worry or issue about like, is there only one answer, is there two answers? That doesn't come into play if you're using the law of sines to find a missing side. And if that doesn't make sense to you, just think about it or look at some examples. If what you're solving for is a side, then there's never really an issue when you're using the law of sines, okay? So this handout is about other weird situations. Like, here we go. If the law of sines can be used first, you know, like if based on what you're given, you're able to use the law of sines to find something that's missing, and what you're going after is an angle, just please remember that there are potentially two answers that you must check. Only one could work, or both could work. Also remember that there might be no solution at all. So that's something you got to keep in mind, okay? And I'll just kind of repeat that, I guess. If you are able to use the law of sines right from the start in order to find big A or big B or big C, just please keep in mind. And essentially this means like, you know, you're doing an inverse sine. You know what I mean? Because whenever you're doing an inverse sine, you got to keep in mind that there is a quadrant 1 answer that's possible, and there's also a quadrant 2 answer that's possible. You know, the quadrant 1 angle might be the only one that's realistic in how many degrees it is. Or, you know, they both could be realistic. But the quadrant 2 angle is the one that could definitely be too big. But also remember that there could be no solution at all when you're doing an inverse sine. But if the law of cosines has to be used first, there are basically two different scenarios. Okay, so again, if you can do the law of sines, you do the law of sines. But if what you're given from the get-go forces you into like one of the law of cosines formulas, then you got to follow these, these precautions or these instructions. So scenario number 1, what you are given is two sides and an angle. In that case, you're just going to naturally react to that by doing the only law of cosines formula you possibly can, and following that. You could use the law of sines and follow the rest of these directions, but you know, we are not going to emphasize that. I mean, it's correct mathematics, you know. Nothing about what's said here or written here is wrong. Like, it's perfectly correct what's written there. But we are going to emphasize this as a rule. Okay? So what we are going to do is we're going to use the law of cosines formula, and then we're going to use the law of cosines formula again. Then you don't have to worry about picking the wrong angle, you know, to find next. All right? And that's the first scenario. And the second scenario would be like you're given three sides. So it's like, it seems like you could start with any of the three angles using the law of cosines, but the fact is that you need to find the largest angle first. Well, that's only if you're doing this, okay? So give me a minute here. That way, whether it's obtuse or whether it's acute, or in other words, quadrant 2 in size or quadrant 1 in size, you know for certain that the other two angles must be acute, which is really good to know when you next use the law of sines. Speaking of the law of sines, you could then use it to find either of the two remaining angles. It really doesn't matter which one you pick. You know they're both quadrant 1 angles. Well, all of this is true. Again, like all of this is actually true. There's nothing wrong about it. But this is not what I'm going to emphasize in this scenario. We're going to emphasize all of this. Right? If we choose to go with the law of cosines for both of the first two angles, it really shouldn't matter which two angles you choose to find or in what order. Remember, only with taking the inverse sine would you be faced with choosing between quadrant 1 and quadrant 2, you know, where both would be good. Or could be good, I guess. When taking the inverse cosine, there's never any doubt which answer could realistically be an angle of an actual triangle. So, yeah. Rather than making sure you pick the absolutely correct, safest angle to go after first with the law of cosines, just plan on doing the law of cosines twice, and that way it doesn't matter. You can pick whichever angle you want to find first and, you know, second. And then after you find the first two angles, then finding the third angle is a piece of cake. So I guess one way to summarize these two scenarios is basically with this sentence. So if you want to write this down somewhere, I welcome you to do it. Basically, if you are forced to do the law of cosines first, then you should do the law of cosines again in order to be like as safe as you possibly can. All right? And that's what I have to say about that handout.